Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The planchette felt ice cold under our fingertips, but the chill that shot up my spine had nothing to do with the room's temperature and everything to do with the secret festering inside me. A grief so profound I hadn't found the words to give it voice. Not even to the man whose hand was pressed against mine. A man who was smiling, eager to ask the board about the children we would one day have, completely unaware that we had already lost one. The flickering candlelight from the two pillars on the floor beside us cast long, dancing shadows that made our living room, usually a sanctuary of soft throws and well-read books, feel like a cavernous, unfamiliar temple dedicated to things best left undisturbed. The air thick with the scent of melting wax and a silence so heavy it seemed to press against my eardrums. A silence I had grown accustomed to over the past 3 weeks. A silence that had become my shroud. Mark's thumb stroked the back of my hand absently, a gesture of casual intimacy that now felt like a brand of deceit, and he whispered with a boyish enthusiasm that carved a fresh wound into my heart. "Okay, is there a spirit here with us tonight?" The planchette, to my utter horror, began to move, a slow, deliberate slide across the smooth, worn surface of the board, and my breath hitched in my throat, a trapped bird of panic, because I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to slush, that I wasn't pushing it. My fingers were feather-light, a terrified hover, yet it moved with a purpose that seemed to emanate from the board itself, gliding smoothly past the row of numbers to settle with an almost audible sigh on the word yes. Mark's face lit up with a delighted, incredulous grin, his eyes reflecting the candle flames, and he squeezed my hand, mistaking my petrified rigidity for shared excitement. "This is amazing," he breathed, his voice a low rumble in the sacred quiet, and I could only nod, a stiff, mechanical motion, my eyes fixed on the triangular piece of plastic and wood that felt less like a toy and more like an instrument of divine, or perhaps infernal, revelation. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone shifting to one of respectful curiosity, and again the planchette moved, a jerky, hesitant journey this time, spelling out a sequence of letters that meant nothing, a jumble of consonants that felt like a lie, a distraction, and I felt a faint, desperate hope that this was all a silly game, a trick of our subconscious minds, a shared psychological glitch we could laugh about later over a bottle of wine, a story to tell at parties. But that hope was a soap bubble, destined to pop. Mark, ever the pragmatist, frowned slightly. "That doesn't make much sense. Maybe it's a weak connection." He cleared his throat, leaning forward, his expression turning earnest, hopeful, and he asked the question I had been dreading since he'd pulled the dusty box from the back of the hall closet. The question that had been the catalyst for this entire terrifying seance. "We want to know about our future. Will we have a family?" The air left the room. The candle flames seemed to freeze mid-flicker. The silence became a physical presence, a third party sitting with us on the Persian rug, holding its breath. My heart was a frantic, hammering thing against my ribs, a wild animal trying to escape the cage of my chest, and a cold sweat beaded on my upper lip, my temples. I wanted to snatch my hand away, to scream, to overturn the board and scatter its letters to the winds, to confess everything in a torrent of tears and apologies. But I was paralyzed, trapped by the weight of my secret and the terrifying anticipation of what was to come. The planchette began to move again, and this time its motion was different. Not the jerky exploration of before, but a smooth, confident, and utterly relentless glide, as if pulled by an invisible wire, a force of undeniable intent. It went straight to the letter, pausing for a heartbeat, and a memory, sharp and cruel as a shard of glass, lanced through my mind. The stark, beautiful capital, on the digital pregnancy test I'd taken 6 weeks ago, a symbol of a future so bright it hurt to look at, a secret I'd hugged to myself for 2 glorious days before sharing it with Mark, his face a sunrise of pure, unadulterated joy as he'd spun me around in our tiny kitchen. The planchette moved to end, and I remembered the names we'd whispered to each other in the dark, his hand resting on my still flat stomach, The old-fashioned elegance of Eleanor for a girl, the strong, simple Theo for a boy, our voices soft with wonder. G followed, and with it came the memory of the first twinge, a faint, distant cramp I'd dismissed as ligament pain, a mere footnote in the grand narrative of my pregnancy, nothing to worry about, I'd told myself, even as a cold knot of fear began to form deep in my gut. The planchette slid to E, and the cramping intensified, a cruel, rhythmic squeezing that had me doubling over in the office bathroom stall. My forehead pressed against the cool metal of the door, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, a silent rehearsal for what was to come. It moved with finality to L, and the word hung in the air between us, complete and utterly damning. Angel. A sound escaped me, a half-choked gasp that was more of a sob, and Mark's head snapped up, his grin faltering as he saw the sheer, unvarnished terror on my face. Angel, he said, his voice laced with confusion, but also a dawning, tentative hope. Does that mean like a guardian angel? Or that we'll have a little angel? He was trying to make it fit, to twist this omen into a blessing, his optimism a shield against the unknown, and the love I felt for him in that moment was a physical ache, a torturous counterpoint to the devastation that was crashing over me in nauseating waves. But the planchette wasn't done. It began to move again, and this time its motion was swift, decisive, a verdict being delivered. It went to L, then O, and a whimper, low and animalistic, rose in my throat because I knew, with a soul-deep certainty that shattered my last vestige of denial, what it was spelling, what the terrible, final word would be. S. The ultrasound room, so cold and bright, the technicians face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't hide the pity in her eyes. The silence of the machine where a heartbeat should have been whooshing, a silent, black screen that showed a void where a universe of potential had been. T. The planchette stopped. Lost. Angel lost. The two words sat there on the board, glowing in the dim light with a malevolent truth, and the world dropped away. The candles, the shadows, the room. Mark's confused face. Everything receded into a blurry, indistinct haze. There was only the board and the truth that had vomited forth, a truth that had not come from any spirit, any demon, any external force at all. The ice-cold certainty flooded me, a clarity more terrifying than any ghost. The weight on the planchette, the force guiding it, it had been me. It was my grief, my unspoken, festering anguish, my secret, given form and movement. It was the ghost of the child we would never know, speaking through the only means I had unconsciously allowed it. This stupid, cheap board game. I had done this. My own hidden heart had reached up through my fingertips and spelled out my ruin for my unsuspecting husband to see. The dam inside me, the one I had built with every suppressed tear, every forced smile, every "I'm just tired" excuse, shattered into a million pieces. A raw, guttural cry was torn from me, a sound I didn't recognize as my own, and I ripped my hands from the planchette as if it had burned me, scrambling backward on the rug, my chest heaving with ragged, uncontrollable sobs. Clara? Clara, what is it? What's wrong? Mark's voice was sharp with alarm, his playful mood vaporized by the sheer violence of my reaction. He moved toward me, his hands outstretched, but I flinched away, wrapping my arms around myself, rocking back and forth, the words finally breaking free in a torrent of agony. I'm so sorry, Mark, I'm so sorry. I choked out, the words barely intelligible between the sobs that racked my body. It was me, it was all me, I moved it, it was my... I couldn't say it. The words stuck in my throat, a boulder of pain. His face was a canvas of confusion and dawning fear. What are you talking about? You moved it? What does angel lost mean? His eyes searched mine, desperate for an answer that wouldn't destroy him, and I saw the moment the first fissure appeared in his understanding, the moment his brain began to connect the dots. My withdrawal these past weeks, my refusal to make love, the way I'd flinched when he'd touched my stomach just yesterday, the profound, unexplained sadness in my eyes that he'd attributed to stress. Clara, he whispered, his voice now small, terrified. Talk to me. And so I did. I told him everything. The words poured out of me in a messy, ugly, cathartic flood, each one a shard of glass tearing me open from the inside. I told him about the positive test, the secret joy, the plans we'd woven in whispers. I described the first cramp, the stubborn hope that it was nothing, the desperate drive to the doctor, the sterile smell of the exam room, the cold gel on my abdomen, the technician's prolonged silence, the way she'd finally said, "I'm so sorry, I can't find a heartbeat." The words that had ended one future and begun this terrible, silent purgatory. I told him about the physical pain, the bleeding, the lonely aftermath in our bathroom, and the even lonelier days that followed, each one a lifetime of carrying this immense, isolating sorrow alone, of watching him live in a world of unbroken hope while I inhabited a world of ashes. I confessed my cowardice, my terror of seeing that sunrise joy in his eyes extinguished, my inability to be the one to bring that darkness into his world. So I had let it fester inside me instead, a poison I thought I could contain. I told him how every day had been a performance, an act of normalcy staged over a gaping chasm of loss, and how the Ouija board had simply given my grief a voice when I could not. I talked until my voice was hoarse and my tears were spent, until I was hollowed out, a shell of a person sitting amidst the wreckage of my own making. Through it all, Mark didn't move. He just listened, his face undergoing a slow, painful transformation from confusion to shock to a profound, heartbreaking anguish that mirrored my own. When I finally fell silent, exhausted and raw, he didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were the sputtering of the candles and our ragged breathing. Then a single tear traced a path down his cheek, catching the light, and he slowly reached out, not to the board, not to the spirit he thought he was communicating with, but to me. His hand, warm and solid, cupped my cheek, his thumb wiping away the wetness there. His own tears were falling freely now, but his voice, when it came, was steady, filled with a love so fierce it was almost a physical force. "Oh, Clara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "My love, you carried this alone, all this time." He didn't yell. He didn't ask why I didn't tell him. He didn't retreat into his own pain. He moved across the space between us and gathered me into his arms, pulling me against his chest, holding me as my body was once again seized with great, racking sobs. But this time they were different. This time, I wasn't alone. He held me through the storm, his own tears wetting my hair, his hands rubbing slow, comforting circles on my back, whispering, I'm here, we're together, we'll get through this together." We sat there on the floor for what felt like an eternity, clinging to each other in the flickering light, the Ouija board between us forgotten, its message delivered, its purpose served. The horror of the evening had not been supernatural. It had been the terrifying, necessary exorcism of a secret that was destroying me from the inside out. The ghost we had contacted was the ghost of our lost child, and the demon we had faced was the specter of grief itself, a monster made powerful only by its isolation. And as we sat there on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of our evening and the ghosts of our hopes, the Ouija board between us forgotten, I realized the real message hadn't been about loss at all. It had been a desperate, silent cry from my own soul, finally heard, and in the echoing silence that followed, we began the long, hard work of healing together for the first time. The silence that followed was not the empty, suffocating silence of the previous weeks, but a shared, breathing entity, a space filled with the raw, unvarnished truth of our loss. And as Mark held me, his heartbeat a steady, reassuring drum against my ear, a rhythm I had feared I'd lost the right to find comfort in, I felt the first fragile tendril of something that wasn't pure agony take root in the scorched earth of my soul, a tiny, trembling shoot of solace that we were now, finally, in this pain together, that the immense weight I had been carrying alone was now distributed across two sets of shoulders, making it no less heavy but infinitely more bearable. He didn't let go, not even when my sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths and the occasional shudder that racked my frame, his arms remaining a steadfast anchor in the turbulent sea of my grief. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and husky with tears he made no effort to hide, his words not of accusation or confusion, but of a shared mourning that began to weave our separate sorrows into a single, cohesive tapestry of loss. "We were going to name her Eleanor," he whispered into my hair, his words a soft echo of the dreams we'd whispered in the dark, and the use of the past tense, so final, so acknowledging, unleashed a fresh wave of tears. But these were different, cleaner somehow, washing away a layer of the isolation that had crusted around my heart. I had a dream about him, I confessed, the words muffled against his shirt. A secret I hadn't dared to voice even to myself, a memory that had felt too precious and too painful to examine. It was after it happened. He had your eyes, and he was laughing, running through a field of tall grass, and I was chasing him, and I was so happy, and then I woke up, and the emptiness, it was like being carved out with a rusty spoon. Mark's arms tightened around me, a soft groan escaping him as if my words had caused him physical pain, and he said, "Oh, my love, I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you woke up. I'm so sorry you had to carry that dream alone." And his apology, so freely given for something that wasn't his fault, shattered another piece of the wall I'd built. We began to talk then, really talk, in a way we hadn't since the world had ended in that sterile ultrasound room. The words spilling out in a hesitant, then frantic, then soothing river, sharing the fragments of our private hells. His confusion at my distance, his worry that he'd done something wrong, his helplessness in the face of a sadness he couldn't name, my terror of his disappointment, my irrational guilt that my body had failed, my envious anger at every heavily pregnant woman and every squalling infant I saw, emotions so ugly I'd buried them deep. We confessed it all, there on the floor, the candles guttering low, casting our intertwined shadows large and wavering on the walls, the Ouija board a silent, forgotten witness to a conversation far more real and terrifying than any communion with the dead could ever be. He asked me about the physical pain, his voice trembling with a delayed protectiveness, and I told him, haltingly, about the cramps, the bleeding, the clinical coldness of the procedure I'd endured alone with a kind nurse holding my hand. And he cried then, great, heaving sobs for the pain he hadn't been there to witness, for the fear I'd faced without him. And I found myself comforting him, my hand stroking his hair, whispering that it was okay, that I was okay, that we were okay now and in that moment, the caregiver and the cared for blurred and merged, and we were simply two people, equally broken, equally lost, finding their way back to each other in the dark. Eventually, the words began to slow, the river of confession narrowing to a stream, then a trickle, until we lapsed into a silence that was no longer fraught with unsaid things, but was instead a quiet, exhausted communion. He shifted slightly, not letting me go, but reaching out with one hand to gently close the lid of the Ouija board. A simple, final gesture that felt profoundly symbolic, closing the door on the supernatural and turning fully to face the human tragedy. And the soft click of the latch closing seemed to seal our new, painful, but shared reality. "We should go to bed," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion and fatigue, and I nodded against his chest, my body feeling leaden, every muscle aching from the tension and the release. He helped me to my feet, his grip firm and sure, and we left the living room as it was, the dying candles, the closed board, the charged air, walking down the hall to our bedroom, a space that had felt like a lonely island for weeks, but now felt like a sanctuary we were re-entering together. He helped me undress with a tenderness that made my throat ache, pulling one of his old t-shirts over my head, and we climbed into our bed, the cool sheets a shock against my skin, and he immediately drew me back into his arms, spooning behind me, his chest against my back, his knees tucked behind mine, his breath warm on my neck, holding me as if I were something precious and fragile, which I realized with a piercing clarity. I was to him, I always had been. We lay there in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, just breathing together, listening to the sound of the house settling around us, the occasional car passing on the wet street outside, the ordinary sounds of a world that had kept turning while ours had stopped, and I felt the truth of his earlier words settle deep into my bones. We would get through this together. The grief was still there, a vast, dark ocean inside me, but I was no longer drowning in it alone. He was there now, holding me up, helping me keep my head above water, and that made all the difference in the world. The horror of the evening had been real and visceral, a psychological terror born of my own subconscious betraying me. But it had been a necessary horror, a catastrophic event that had broken the dam and allowed the healing to finally begin. I thought of the planchette spelling out "Angel Lost," and now, in the safe darkness held by my husband, I could allow myself to think of the life we had lost not just as a medical event or a failure, but as a little soul, a potential person who was in a way our angel, and who was undeniably lost to us, and acknowledging that, speaking it aloud and sharing that acknowledgement, was the first step on the long road toward not moving on. Never that, but moving forward, carrying that loss with us as a part of our story, a sad chapter but not the whole book. I felt Mark's breathing even out into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep behind me, his arm a comforting weight across my waist, and I finally allowed my own eyes to close, exhaustion pulling me under into a dreamless, heavy sleep, not a peace, not yet, but a cessation of the war that had been raging inside me, a truce called in the silent, understanding dark. The morning light that filtered through the gaps in our blinds was not the harsh, accusatory glare I had grown accustomed to, but a soft, gray, forgiving luminescence, and I awoke not with the usual leaden weight of dread pressing down on my chest, but with a profound and aching emptiness, a hollowed-out quiet that felt, if not peaceful, then at least neutral, a blank page after a story written in blood had finally been concluded. Mark was still asleep beside me, his arms still draped possessively, protectively over me, his face relaxed in slumber, but with traces of the previous night's anguish etched in the faint lines around his eyes, a map of our shared sorrow, and I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to break the fragile, newfound truce that existed in the quiet of our bedroom, listening to his steady breathing and allowing myself to simply exist within the sphere of his warmth. A feeling I had been denying myself for weeks, the simple animal comfort of another body, of not being alone. The memories of the previous night returned not as a crashing wave of panic, but as a slow, sobering tide, the searing pain of the confession, the terrifying clarity of my own subconscious betrayal through the planchette, the raw, unfiltered agony in Mark's eyes as he understood, and then the astonishing, life-saving grace of his embrace, his tears mingling with mine, his refusal to let me bear the burden alone, and the gratitude that washed over me was so potent it brought a fresh, quieter set of tears to my eyes, tears that slipped silently down my temples and into my hairline. He stirred then, as if sensing the shift in my breathing, his eyes fluttering open, and for a heart-stopping second, I saw a flicker of the previous night's confusion and pain cross his features before his gaze focused on me, and his expression softened into something so deeply tender and understanding that it made my heart clench. "Hey," he whispered, his voice gravelly with sleep, his thumb coming up to gently wipe the tear tracks from my skin. "Hey," I whispered back, my voice small and raspy from the storm of tears, and we just looked at each other for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between us, an acknowledgement of the chasm we had peered into together and the slow, careful bridge we were now beginning to build across it. He didn't ask if I was okay. The question would have been absurd, an insult to the magnitude of what we had lost and what we had finally shared. Instead, he asked, "What do you need?" And the simplicity of the question, the selflessness of it, undid me all over again. I didn't know what I needed. I needed a time machine. I needed my body to not have betrayed us. I needed to not have spent 3 weeks lying to the person I loved most in the world. I needed the phantom weight of a pregnancy that was no longer there to finally, fully vanish. But those were impossible needs. So I said the only thing that felt true in that moment, the only thing that felt within the realm of this new, raw reality. "I need you to not let go," I murmured, and he understood, pulling me closer, tucking my head under his chin, holding me as if I were the most fragile and valuable thing in his world. And we lay like that for a long time, until the gray light brightened into proper morning, and the sounds of the world outside our window became more insistent. The process of getting out of bed was arduous, like learning to walk again after a long illness, every movement feeling both heavy and strangely light, the absence of the secret I had carried for so long leaving a void that was disorienting. We moved through our small apartment in a kind of tandem, a silent, coordinated dance of grief and care. He would make coffee, and I would stand beside him, leaning my head against his shoulder, taking strength from his solid presence. I would shower, and he would sit on the closed lid of the toilet, talking to me about nothing, about everything, his voice a steady anchor against the roar of the water, and the occasional tremor that would run through me as a memory, sharp and sudden, would pierce through the numbness. We avoided the living room, a silent, mutual agreement, leaving the detritus of our failed seance and emotional cataclysm for later, for a time when we felt strong enough to face it. The world outside our windows continued its mundane routine. Cars passing, a dog barking, the mailman making his rounds, and the normalcy of it all felt both jarring and comforting, a reminder that life, in its relentless, indifferent way, went on, and that perhaps we could too eventually. We didn't talk about the future, not the long-term one littered with questions of when to try again, or if we should, or what this meant for our dreams of a family. Those conversations were mountains in the distance, too far off to scale today. Today was about the next minute, the next hour. It was about Mark making me toast I couldn't quite eat, but nibbling on because he'd made it for me. It was about me finally showing him the small, secret box I'd hidden at the back of my underwear drawer. The one containing the positive test and the ultrasound picture that showed only a silent, empty sack, and him holding it with trembling hands, crying quietly as he truly saw the physical evidence of the child we'd lost, making its existence and its loss real and tangible for him in a way it hadn't been before. It was about sitting on the couch, wrapped in a single blanket, watching some mindless television show without really seeing it, just feeling the comfort of his body next to mine, the occasional squeeze of his hand reminding me that I was not alone in this, that the isolation was over. The true horror of the previous night had not been in the moving planchette or the spelled words. The true horror had been the profound, soul-crushing loneliness of my grief, a monster that grew in the dark silence of my own making. The exorcism performed by that stupid board game had been brutal and terrifying, but it had been effective. It had forced the monster out into the light where my husband could see it, could name it, and could help me fight it. And as the day wore on, moving from the gray morning into a pale afternoon sun that struggled through the clouds, I began to understand that the work of healing was not a single event, but a series of moments. A choice made over and over again to lean into the pain together rather than apart, to let the grief be a thing that connected us rather than divided us. And as Mark reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine without a word, his touch saying everything that needed to be said, I felt the first faint and terrifying thrill of hope, a tiny, determined spark in the vast darkness, and I held onto his hand as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to the world, which, in that moment, it was. The afternoon sun, a weak and watery gold, had climbed higher, painting slow-moving rectangles of light across the floorboards, and we remained there on the couch, anchored in our shared silence, until the mundane necessities of life began to reassert their gentle, inexorable pressure. The grumbling of our stomachs reminding us that grief, for all its consuming power, still operates within a body that requires fuel. The dry taste in my mouth a testament to the torrent of tears I had shed. Mark was the first to move, his joints cracking softly as he unfolded himself from the couch, his hand giving mine one final, reassuring squeeze before letting go, a loss of contact that felt momentarily terrifying, as if he were a lifeline I was being forced to release. But he simply moved into the kitchen, not away from me, and began the familiar, comforting ritual of making us a proper meal. The sounds of the refrigerator opening, the clatter of pots and pans, the sizzle of butter in a skillet, all of them ordinary sounds that now felt like a delicate symphony of normalcy being painstakingly reconstructed. I didn't offer to help. I knew he needed to do this, needed the tangible, productive act of caring for me in this basic way, and I needed to let him, to accept this sustenance as the offering of love it was. So I stayed on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, watching him move with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed not in anger or sadness, but in concentration, a temporary reprieve from the emotional maelstrom that I knew was still swirling just beneath the surface. For both of us, he made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, a childhood comfort food, and the smell of toasting bread and warm tomatoes filled the apartment, layering over the lingering scent of candle wax from the other room. A small but significant victory of the present over the haunting remnants of the previous night. We ate at the coffee table, cross-legged on the floor, not speaking, the only sounds the quiet slurping of soup and the soft crunch of bread. And it was in that simple, shared act of eating that I felt another layer of the ice around my heart begin to thaw. It was so normal, so utterly mundane, and yet it felt like a monumental step, a quiet reaffirmation that life, in its most basic forms, could and would continue. After we ate, the elephant in the room, or rather, the Ouija board in the next room, could no longer be ignored. The door to the living room was closed, but its presence was a palpable force, a dark star whose gravity we both felt pulling at us. Mark looked at me, his expression asking the question without words, and I took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. We had to face it, to clean up the physical evidence of our spiritual and emotional disaster, to reclaim that space as our own. He stood and offered me his hand, pulling me to my feet, and we walked to the door together, pausing for a moment with our hands on the knob, a shared deep breath before pushing it open. The room was exactly as we had left it, frozen in a moment of high drama that now felt distant and surreal. The candles had burned themselves out, leaving hardened puddles of white wax on the hardwood floor and the brass holders. The planchette sat askew on the board, no longer looking like a malevolent oracle, but like a cheap piece of plastic, a toy that had been used for a purpose far beyond its design. The air still held a faint, acrid hint of extinguished wicks. Mark moved first, his practicality a shield, picking up the candle holders and carrying them to the kitchen to deal with the wax later, then returning with a trash bag. He looked at me, a question in his eyes, and I knew what he was asking: what to do with the board itself. It felt tainted, not by any external spirit, but by the projection of my own profound sorrow, a relic of a pain I never wanted to revisit in that way again. I walked over to it, my steps hesitant, and looked down at the letters, the sun-faded yes and goodbye, the numbers, the entire alphabet that had been the instrument of my unraveling. I didn't touch it. "I don't want it in the house," I said, my voice firmer than I expected it to be, and Mark nodded, not questioning me, simply opening the trash bag and carefully tipping the board into it, the planchette clattering in after it, the sound final and dismissive. He tied the bag shut, a simple, decisive act that felt incredibly symbolic, and carried it out to the building's dumpster. And when he returned, the room already felt lighter, the oppressive energy dissipated, leaving only the faint smell of wax that would soon air out. We opened a window, letting in the cool, fresh afternoon air, and the mundane sounds of a Saturday. Children playing somewhere down the street, a lawnmower humming in the distance, flowed in, further diluting the memory of the intense, cloistered horror of the night before. We spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, purposeful activity, not talking much but staying close, tidying the apartment, doing laundry, the ordinary chores acting as a kind of meditation, a way to re-inhabit our lives and our space together, to mark the passing of time not with dramatic speeches or tearful breakdowns, but with the simple, healing rhythm of shared domesticity. As evening drew in, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange, we found ourselves back on the couch, tired but not exhausted in that soul-deep way we had been the night before, and Mark turned to me, his expression serious but calm. We should think about what we want to do," he said softly, and I knew he wasn't talking about dinner or tomorrow plans. He was talking about the memory, about the child we had lost. "We don't have to decide anything now," he added quickly, seeing the flicker of anxiety that must have crossed my face. "But maybe we could think about a way to acknowledge it. For us." The idea was both terrifying and deeply comforting. For weeks, the loss had been a festering, secret wound. The idea of bringing it into the light, of giving it a shape and a form that we could both look at and hold, was daunting, but it also felt right, like the necessary next step on this path we were now walking together. We talked about it then, tentatively, hesitantly, throwing out ideas that felt either too grandiose or too small, until we settled on something simple, something private, something that felt true to us. We would plant a tree, a sapling of a dogwood we both loved, in the community garden a few blocks away, a living thing that would grow and change with the seasons, a quiet, personal memorial that existed outside of our home, a place we could visit if we wanted to or simply know was there, a testament to a life that was brief but had profoundly changed ours. Making the decision, having a plan, however small, felt like taking a tiny shred of control back from the chaos of loss. And as we sat there in the gathering dark, the streetlights outside flickering on one by one, I felt the first genuine, unforced connection to the future. A future that was still shrouded in uncertainty and would always hold this sorrow, but a future we would face side by side. And when Mark leaned over and kissed me, his lips soft and familiar against mine, it was not a kiss of passion but one of profound understanding, a seal on the pact we had made to navigate this new, altered landscape of our lives together. And for the first time in weeks, I kissed him back without a wall of secrets between us, without the ghost of my grief pressing its cold hand between us. And it felt like a beginning, fragile and terrifying, but a beginning nonetheless.